That was a great session, Ed, and Commissioner Breton. That's fantastic. Good morning from this side of the pond that unites us all, from the Atlantic Council headquarters in Washington, D.C. Good afternoon to all of those joining us from Europe, and welcome to listeners elsewhere in the world. I'm Fred Kempe. I'm President and CEO of the Atlantic Council, and thank you for joining us on this second day of our EU-US Future Forum. And what an extraordinary first day we had. Yesterday, we highlighted the transatlantic ties that bind, focusing on the history and values that unite us in the digital age. Be sure to check out some key portions of this interesting conversation from yesterday on our website, atlanticcouncil.org, including a discussion between former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, and historian and good friend of mine, Timothy Garton-Ash, on transatlantic values, where Secretary Albright stressed the necessity of the EU to Americans, underlying the whole purpose of the EU-US Future Forum, that we understand how important we remain, or perhaps even are more than ever before, to each other. We had 4 back-to-back sessions on transatlantic digital policy, technology, and democratic values in the digital age, a set of issues at the core of the dialogue between the EU and the US. Speakers asserted that we should focus on, quote, democratic autonomy, unquote, rather than strategic autonomy, and that we should make, quote again, make digital the next coal and steel, looking to this year's anniversary of the European Coal and Steel Community. One highlight was an intriguing conversation between European Commission Vice President Vera Jourova and US Senator Chris Murphy on how to defend democratic principles and resilience in a digital age. Also, be sure to listen on the conversation between President of Estonia Kersti Kaljulaid and Senator Jean Shaheen, 2 of my favorite leaders, where they stress the need for transatlantic solidarity in pushing back against Russian and authoritarian powers in our foreign and defense policies, without forgetting to invest in people, economies, and infrastructure on the home front. So it was all powerful stuff. Today, we turn to focus on the economic perspective. We just heard from European Commissioner for the Internal Market, Thierry Breton, and now I have the privilege of sitting down for a discussion with one of the world's premier business leaders, Guillaume Faury, Chief Executive Officer of Airbus. So Guillaume, it's wonderful to have you with us. There is, I think, some rich symbolism of having you join us after Commissioner Breton of France, a Frenchman, and the head of the German Green Party, who will follow Annalena Baerbock in her first interview since she was chosen as the party's candidate for chancellor. I'm delighted that we're going to talk about the transatlantic economic relationship as a driver for recovery from the pandemic, and also how your company has weathered a crisis that's hit your industry rather hard. So Guillaume, and I'll make this introduction short, Guillaume has been the CEO of Airbus since 2019. He's a member, and we're proud to say that, of the Atlantic Council's International Advisory Board. Guillaume, your love of flying and aviation dates back to your childhood, as I understand it. And what's more, he is even a qualified light aircraft pilot and helicopter flight test engineer with 1,300 hours of flight experience. So with that, I think that should elevate our conversation. I encourage everyone to follow along in the discussion by using the hashtag EUFF on Twitter and asking questions via our Atlantic Council Events app, which you can download from either the Apple app marketplace or Google Play store. So with that, Guillaume, let's begin. And thank you again for joining us for this forum. First, maybe a bit of a situation report. You're more the expert than I am, but it seems to me that COVID-19 is the biggest crisis the modern aviation industry has ever faced, and perhaps for Airbus specifically as well. Can you talk about that, and also how you've adapted?
So first of all, good morning, Fred. It's my privilege to be with you this morning on your side of the pond. Indeed, you're right. COVID-19 has been for the aviation the biggest crisis ever since the outset of this great industry. It's been brutal, and even more brutal that we were in a big ramp up at that time. Our supply chain, ourselves were investing for more production moving forward. And we had to face the brutal reality of the vast majority of the commercial planes around the world being grounded more than a year ago. We started by trying to face reality as good as we could at that time. We worked on scenarios, trying to understand how long the crisis would last. I have to confess, probably March last year, we didn't think we would still be in that situation today, more than a year later. So we worked on scenarios, and we decided very quickly to reduce our production by 40%, assuming that deliveries would recover to a certain extent and then match with this new production rates. We worked with the supply chain to reorganize everything to fit with this new level of production. We worked with all our customers around the world to try to understand their new situation, how to defer planes, to adapt pre-delivery payments. And it was a hell of a lot of work, basically, to try to rebuild everything. We had as well to protect our employees, find new ways of producing planes with the COVID-19 constraints. And I would say after our first half of the year where we lost a huge amount of money, we stabilized the situation in the third quarter, and we started to make money again in the fourth quarter and in 2021 as well in the first quarter. Obviously, having reduced our expenses very much, we have also reduce the workforce, but we have found ways to sort of limit the impact of the pandemic and the crisis on the workforce. And we are now prudently looking at end of 2021, 2022, with the potential to start to ramp up again from that low point for what we call the single aisle, so the narrow body planes. For the long range planes and for the long range business for airlines, we think the tipping point will probably not be before mid of next year, as the different countries of the world, the different regions of the world are really managing the situation in very different ways. It will take a lot of time to reopen. So that was last year. I have to say the solidarity of the supply chain of aviation has just been amazing to try to go through that crisis, to weather the storm together. And we are slowly but surely making progress with the hope that aviation air traffic will start again to pick up, moving closer to summer 2021.
Thank you so much for that fascinating opening answer. Looking to a ramping up of some sort on shorter range at the end of this year, early next year, and then longer haul middle of next year. But you did talk about how the pace is different in different places. And the United States, at this point with vaccination, seems to be far ahead of Europe. The full return to flights seems to be coming here faster, but we also see trends in India and otherwise other places that could make us a little nervous about that. What will, and also news on this side of the Atlantic, this side of the pond, Guillaume, of deliveries to JetBlue that I've read about Airbus in last so the US is ordering and taking delivery of new planes. What is it going to take to get Europe back? And in general, as you're seeing the new variants come out of COVID, how worried are you about setbacks in the months ahead that make it so you can't hit the targets you're talking about?
Well, we are a sort of long-term industry, and we need plans over many months, over years, and the pandemic is not providing this visibility. Therefore, we have to prepare ourselves for more resilience than what we've seen in the past. It's very refreshing to see the situation in the US moving very quickly in the right direction. There is a sentiment of optimism in the US that I like very much. And it's true that the vaccination campaign has been very efficient, very fast. but it's also a good signal for the other countries, for the other regions of the world. I mean, when the vaccination campaign starts to reach a certain point, then the contamination goes down, economy can reopen, activity can start again. So I'm hopeful that Europe, having started later with a lot of issues on the coordination among the countries, and I have my frustrations on the situation in Europe, but I think the US is showing the way. The vaccination campaign in Europe as well is making good progress now. And I am quite optimistic, hopeful at least, that Europe will follow US, probably with a couple of months of delay. But would it be later? If we can be in the same situation for the summer and have a good summer, have reopening of the majority of businesses, I think the pent-up demand is very strong in Europe as well. And people are willing to start to live again. They are expecting more freedom than what they have today. They know we need to put the pandemic under a certain level of control, and they believe, and I believe, the vaccination campaign is the way to get there, because when we look at the US, that's the case. So hopefully we have US, Europe, other parts of the world following, then we have reopening of the majority of businesses, including aviation, and that will be the start of the end, the beginning of the end.
I think you know, Guillaume, how devoted the Atlantic Council is to the transatlantic community, the transatlantic economy, sort of the centerpiece for the world economy. And we've long believed that this dispute between Airbus and Boeing hurts everyone in a way in the global competition. But what was encouraging was that the US and EU entered a 4-month suspension of tariffs related to the Airbus-Boeing dispute, and the US trade chief recently proposed a 6-month tariff freeze. But these are still short-term measures. And I'm just wondering what you see as the prospect for a longer-term solution to this issue, and how important do you find this whole matter for the economy in general?
Thank you for the question, Fred. I think aviation is mainly a North Atlantic ecosystem. We Airbus buy from the US a lot. The US companies and Boeing buy from Europe. We sell to Europe, to the rest of the world, to the US, and vice versa. Aviation is a small business. I mean, before the pandemic, we were delivering all together, Boeing and us and all the suppliers contributing to it, around up to 1,500 planes a year. So that's very small, actually, in terms of numbers. And of course, last year we delivered hardly half of these numbers. So it's a small ecosystem, and it's a North Atlantic ecosystem. And putting trade barriers, putting tariffs in the middle of the Atlantic, in my view, and I've been quite transparent on that topic from the beginning, is not making sense. I think with escalation of the tariffs and the decisions of the WTO, we are now in a situation where it's really obvious that this is a lose-lose situation for everyone, and we are much better off finding a resolution to the dispute. So I'm happy to see that on both sides, there is what I believe, what I perceive as a real intention to find a resolution. There are some subsidies, and there have been subsidies in the past on aviation, both sides of the Atlantic, in different ways. Obviously, each side believes the other way is not the right one. So we need to come to a situation where it's more or less acceptable for both parties and move forward. And the situation today is even more unfortunate that we have COVID-19 and that we are in a very difficult situation. So I trust the short-term situation you were mentioning before, the short-term ceasefire is the way to find a resolution and then go to a more long-term situation. And it will allow us to address other challenges, other players, newcomers that come also with some strong support from their states. And I think it is the interest of both the EU and the US and Boeing and Airbus to find an agreement and to move forward.
I don't want to press you too hard on this, but what are the prospects for that long-term solution? It's taken us a long time to get here. How long is it going to take us to get out of this dispute?
I believe it's just a matter of willingness. I don't see any obstacle that cannot be resolved in the dispute. It was a long-term situation that developed over 15 years. No party was willing to accept the situation imposed by the other one. So, but having looked at the consequences of these tariffs going up, I think everybody understands it's better to find an agreement. So there will be an agreement. There was an agreement, by the way, 15 years ago. You remember there was a standstill agreement between Boeing and Airbus that worked for more than a decade, I think. So it's not something that cannot be resolved. And if the EU and the US have the willingness to sit down and look at the situation and agree on what can be acceptable and what is not, even if it has a different flavor on both sides, I think it's just a matter of willingness. So I'm very optimistic that now that we see on both sides a willingness to get to that deal, that we'll get it. And by the way, going back to the previous situation with tariffs would really be meaningless for both Boeing and Airbus and all the other industries which are impacted. So that's another reason why I'm quite optimistic.
Thank you so much for that, Guillaume. Let's talk a little bit about China. Thierry Breton, the European Commissioner, spoke about it. He spoke about clean networks and 5G. If I'm not mistaken, and you can correct me if this is wrong, you sell 25% or more of your planes in China, maybe during COVID-19 coming out, that could grow. How important is that market for Airbus, and how do you see it developing in the years ahead?
The Chinese market, be it for Airbus or Boeing, was sort of 20 to 25% of the global market in the past recent years. As far as I remember, last year, 2020, for us, it was around 20%, maybe slightly less than 20% in terms of number of deliveries out of the 566 planes we delivered last year. And we think China will remain a very important market moving forward on the planet. As we have today mainly two commercial airplane manufacturers that are competitive, Boeing and Airbus, this Chinese market is shared between the two players in different ways on the single aisle and the wide bodies. But I'm just trying to say, basically, it's been an important market. It will remain an important market. They will progressively come with a domestic product. You know that COMAC is developing the 919. That will be a single aisle product entering into the market probably next year or the year later. It will start slowly, probably reaching at the beginning only the Chinese airlines. But we believe this will progressively become a decent player. So we will go probably from a duopoly to a triopoly, at least on the single aisle, by the end of the decade. And therefore, Chinese markets, even with this new player, will continue to be, for Boeing, for Airbus, a very important market to address.
So by the end of the decade, there's going to be Airbus, Boeing, and a Chinese rival. It will be a triopoly instead of a duopoly, in your view?
That's not an unlikely scenario. It's still difficult to say at what speed and with what level of competitiveness COMAC will be able to introduce the 919 in the market. We believe they will start with China because the Chinese airlines are state-owned companies and it's easier to do it. It takes a lot of time to demonstrate the maturity of a product, to make it reliable, trusted, and economically viable. But we believe it's not unlikely that on the single aisle, by the end of the decade, COMAC will have taken a certain share of the market.
Thank you for that. You spoke earlier about supply chains and how they've held up in aviation. If you look at the auto industry, it's a nightmare right now with semiconductors and shortages of semiconductors. Could you compare what's happened in the aviation industry? What issues have you had during COVID-19 with global supply chains? How do you think they'll change going forward?
We have looked very seriously and very deeply into the supply chain during COVID-19, and we continue to do it. We've put in place with other companies, other OEMs, what we call watch towers. with two main objectives. One is to get transparency and anticipation on the evolution of the situation of the suppliers, not to be in a situation that what you're describing with semiconductors in the car industry. And we have as well equipped ourselves with, funds or with tools to be able to intervene with equity on the suppliers that would potentially be in a very difficult situation. What we've done as well on the Airbus side, we have done our very best to provide visibility on the levels of production that would be expected on our planes and try to be as stable as possible to give the opportunity for our suppliers to plan, to execute, and to be able to be resilient in that crisis. For the moment, it's been quite successful. I remain very prudent and humble because we see the situation is still evolving very quickly. We've seen with India, I think you referred to it, a big change, a drastic and fast change on the situation. So we remain quite prudent. And if I have to give an appreciation, a sentiment on the state of the supply chain today, I think we have not a situation similar to what you mentioned before. The majority, if not all suppliers, have found ways to weather the situation. There are some exceptions and we are dealing with them. But generally speaking, the aviation supply chain has managed to survive the situation and not impact the OEMs in a way that would prevent us from delivering planes. So I remain humble because things can change very quickly. We've seen that what happened on the car industry was not on the radar scope a couple of months before it happened. That's why we have the watchtowers and we are trying to anticipate as much as we can, gaining visibility. But again, prudently, I can tell you today, we don't see a similar situation in aviation, at least not for the moment, and I hope it will stay like this.
Well, thank you very much for that. My next question might have even been at the center of a conversation I would have had with you a few years ago when Airbus was competing for a Pentagon tanker contract. And we all remember back to the disappointment at that time for Airbus. But what do you see as the outlook for transatlantic defense cooperation?
It's a cooperation in the sense that the US and the European countries are together in NATO. NATO is probably the strongest alliance we've ever been in, and at least in the recent history. And it's very important that both the European countries and the US continue to contribute to NATO. When it comes to defense, European countries are buying US goods, US products. They've done it in the past, but Europe wants also to reinforce its own defense industry. I think it was very much supported by the president administration in the US that pushed Europe to take probably more care of its own sovereignty. And we believe at Airbus that it was a good move for Europe. We think it will continue, but with probably a more longer perspective, a US that is seen from Europe as more cooperative with this Biden administration than it was the case with the previous one. And at the end of the day, the situation is such that we are competing and cooperating. And that's the very nature of the transatlantic relationship, is that we have competitors both sides. It's a tough competition. I think it's very healthy as long as we have a level playing field and that it's an amicable competition. And when it comes to defense, as we are together in NATO, yes, there is a tough competition. We want the rules of the games to be fair, both sides. And what we really didn't like in the case you reminded us just before is we had the feeling it was not completely a fair competition. But when it's a fair competition, it's healthy and it's okay. And it's helping both sides to develop more competitive products. Now, having deep cooperation between OEMs, between companies, both sides of the Atlantic is not that easy. So we buy from each other, we buy components, but large cooperations are more frequent in Europe between European countries than across the Atlantic for the reasons I tried to mention before.
Just looking to the clock and knowing we don't have that much time left, I won't drill down so much on that issue, but we certainly, the Atlantic Council, hope for deeper transatlantic defense cooperation. And so looking for ways to achieve that will be in our interests. But I'd like to turn to green technologies. It's one of the areas where I've been watching Airbus closest. And you recently made a big announcement about the role hydrogen could play. I think you spoke of full hydrogen planes by 2035. And that was way ahead of where I think the thinking has been on this side of the Atlantic and also within Boeing. Tell us why you're so confident of that and where things are going in terms of green technology and aerospace.
We've always been very focused on environment, but even more recently than in the past because of the trend becoming bigger and bigger, and probably also the feeling of urgency with the climate change and the global warming being stronger every day. There are short-term, mid-term, and long-term measures when it comes to bringing the solutions to the market. On the short term, the best way to reduce the emissions is to replace all planes that have a much higher, much bigger fuel burn by modern ones, which are by far more efficient and therefore release less CO2 per passenger and per kilometer. Then on the short term, mid-term, we have the opportunity to work with sustainable aviation fuels. And together with the airlines, I think together with Boeing, by the way, on that front, we believe the SAFs are the avenue for the next years. The planes we are delivering are today already capable
and for an audience that doesn't know what a SAF is, could you translate SAF for us?
Sustainable aviation fuel. Okay, these are biofuels or fuels which have a very low carbon content. Thank you, Fred, to remind me.
I'm sorry to have interrupted. Yeah.
No, thank you for that. But the sustainable aviation fuels are a very good short-term, mid-term solution. But we believe on the long term, we have to find ways of not emitting any carbon in the atmosphere. A solution that is net zero is not enough. And to go to that point, we come to the conclusion that hydrogen is one of the solutions, if not the solution. On top, we see a very strong momentum for hydrogen for many other industries as a way to store intermittent energies like solar, like wind energy, and this will be required. So we see a convergence. We are using hydrogen on our rockets, on our satellites. This is liquid hydrogen. I was in the car industry a decade ago, and we see the car industry, the truck industry going to hydrogen, and we think that's really a strong opportunity. That's why we've put the hydrogen plane very high on our agenda. It's not the only answer, and it's more a long-term answer. We are fully cognizant of that, but we think that's a fantastic opportunity for the long term to have aviation not only being the only mode of transport to not impose anything on the ground. You don't need an infrastructure on the ground. You don't need to damage the ecosystems on the ground. You fly in the air, but on top, not releasing carbon in the air. There are engineering challenges, there are technological challenges, that's for sure, but we don't believe, or we believe they will be overcome. And we see the time frame to 2035, a very credible one. So we think on the plane side, it will be okay. We will need as well large quantities of decarbonized fuels, be them e-fuels or hydrogen. The e-fuels are one sort of sustainable aviation fuels, artificial ones. And we will need a regulation. We will need a global framework for aviation. In that sense, we very much welcome the momentum given by Joe Biden and the administration to be back to the Paris Agreement and to put the bar very high. So if we have US, Europe, and potentially China joining to create this level playing field for carbon in aviation, then we will have the means to invest on technologies to bring decarbonized planes and to contribute to aviation for the future in a climate neutral way. So that's why we are very adamant to see hydrogen on planes.
And just very briefly to close, is there a chance for Airbus to engage in transatlantic cooperation with, as you said, the Biden administration being so for this. So not just countries around the world, but your company in transatlantic cooperation on green technology across the Atlantic.
Yes, of course. We are not always well understood as Airbus. Sometimes from the US, we are seen as a European Boeing. That's not what we are. We are a more global company. We have assembly lines, activities in the US big time. We buy a lot in the US, we sell in the US. So we are a very strong player in the US, and we are already cooperating with the US industry big time. So for this fantastic challenge that is the decarbonization of aviation, the climate agenda, we look forward to more cooperation with the US partners, with the US administration. Why not? We want to be understood for what we are, a very strong player in the US, for the US, with employment in the country, in the satellite business, in helicopters, and of course, on the commercial airplane. We have assembly lines for the 320 family, for the A220 in the US, and that's what we are. So we are already cooperating, and we are very much willing to cooperate even more in the future.
Guillaume, it has been a delight to fly through this half hour with you with such a fascinating conversation. And thank you so much for taking the time for the EU-US Future Forum. And I hope the next time we'll see each other in person.
My great pleasure, Fred. Looking forward to seeing you soon.
Great, thank you. Bye-bye. I invite everyone to continue following along with the EU-US Future Forum Interchangeable and the great programming that's yet to come. Today we have conversations on China with Senator James Risch and a discussion on local resilience with mayors of cities from both sides of the Atlantic. Also, stay tuned for the interview with the German Greens Party co-leader Annalena Baerbock with my friend Fareed Zakaria of CNN today at 11:10 Eastern Time. This will be her first US interview since officially becoming the Green Party's chancellor. I think there's a high degree of interest to see what she's going to say. And of course, the federal elections are this September, so not so far off. We also will hear from a joint conversation, and this one I think everyone should tune into as well, between the US Energy Secretary Jennifer Granholm and the European Commissioner for Energy, Kadri Simpson. I think they'll touch on the sorts of issues that Guillaume Faury just shared with us as well, the almost revolutionary opportunity that hydrogen could provide for air travel. These will all be can't miss sessions, so stay tuned. It was great to have Guillaume Faury with us, and now I'm going to turn it back over to Katerina Soku, a senior fellow of the Atlantic Council, who's going to pick up on the issues of transatlantic trade in a post-COVID-19 environment. Thank you so much.